At Dean Martin's funeral, a stranger stepped forward claiming to be his son, but the DNA test that followed revealed a secret that would have destroyed Dean's reputation forever. December 28, 1995. The morning air in Beverly Hills was crisp and unnaturally quiet, as if even the California sunshine understood that it was witnessing the end of an era. The chapel at Pierce Brothers Westwood Memorial Park was filled with the last remnants of Hollywood's golden age, a gathering of legends who had come to say goodbye to one of their own. Frank Sinatra sat in the front row, his shoulders bent with grief and the weight of 80 years. Nancy Sinatra clutched a handkerchief that had already been soaked with tears. Sammy Davis Jr.'s widow, Altavis, stared at the mahogany casket with the hollow eyes of someone who had buried too many friends. The service had been everything Dean Martin would have wanted: elegant, understated, and mercifully brief. Dean had never been a man for dramatics, even in death. His daughter Deanna had spoken about his love for his family, his generosity, his quiet dignity. Jerry Vale had sung "That's Amore," in a voice that cracked with emotion. The eulogies painted a picture of a man who had lived fully, loved deeply, and died peacefully in his sleep on Christmas Day. But as the service concluded and the mourners began filing out into the California sunshine, something happened that no one could have anticipated. A man approached the family area where Dean's children and grandchildren were receiving condolences. He was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with dark hair that was beginning to show touches of silver at the temples. He wore a black suit that looked expensive but not flashy, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that seemed familiar to those who had known Dean well. The man's hands were shaking as he approached Deanna Martin, Dean's daughter and the unofficial head of the Martin family since their father's death. Deanna looked up at him with the polite but distant expression she had been wearing all morning, the face of someone who had been accepting condolences from strangers for 3 hours and was emotionally exhausted. "Miss Martin," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry for your loss. My name is Michael Torrino, and I believe Dean Martin was my father." The words hit the gathered family like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension and disbelief. Deanna Martin stared at this stranger who had just claimed to be her half-brother, her mind struggling to process what she had heard. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "What did you say?" Michael Torrino reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope that was worn and yellowed with age. His hands were trembling more visibly now, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "I've been carrying this for 25 years, he said, waiting for the right time to make contact. "I never wanted to disrupt his life or embarrass his family, but now that he's gone, I thought you should know the truth." He opened the envelope and pulled out a collection of documents, letters, photographs, and what appeared to be legal papers. The photos showed a young woman with dark hair and striking eyes, sitting at what looked like a nightclub table. The letters were written in Dean's distinctive handwriting, though the ink had faded to a pale blue over the decades. "This is my mother," Michael said, holding up one of the photographs. "Her name was Rosa Torrino. She worked as a cocktail waitress at the Villa Venice in 1950. That's where she met your father." The Villa Venice. Deanna Martin knew the name. It was the Chicago nightclub owned by mobster Sam Giancana, where the Rat Pack had performed numerous times over the years. Her father had never talked much about those early days in Chicago, but she knew he had spent considerable time there in the early 1950s, building his solo career after breaking up with Jerry Lewis. Craig Martin, Dean's son, stepped forward to examine the documents more closely. He was a practical man, a lawyer by training, and his first instinct was to protect his family from what could be an elaborate con game targeting a grieving family's vulnerability. "Mr. Torrino," Craig said, his voice professional but not unkind, "I'm sure you understand that we'll need more than old photographs and letters to substantiate such a claim. There are DNA tests, legal procedures." "I know," Michael interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "I wouldn't have come here if I wasn't absolutely certain. My mother told me the truth when I turned 18. She gave me these letters, these photographs. She told me about the monthly checks that came for 40 years, right up until last month when they suddenly stopped. Monthly checks." The words sent a chill through the Martin family. If this man was telling the truth, it meant their father had been secretly supporting another child for 4 decades. It meant he had been living a double life, carrying a secret that could have destroyed his reputation and devastated his family. Gina Martin, Dean's youngest daughter, looked at the photographs with tears in her eyes. There was something about the woman's face, something familiar in the shape of her eyes and the curve of her smile, that reminded her uncomfortably of family photos she had seen from the same era. "She was beautiful," Gina said quietly, and Michael nodded. "She was, and she loved him. She never asked for anything more than he was willing to give. She never tried to contact him after I was born. She just raised me on her own and told me stories about the man who was my father." The gathering crowd of mourners had begun to notice the commotion around the Martin family. Whispers started to spread through the chapel as people strained to see what was happening. Frank Sinatra's bodyguards stepped closer, sensing potential trouble. Entertainment reporters who had been respectfully keeping their distance suddenly became more alert. Dana Martin made a decision that would change her family's understanding of their father forever. "Mr. Torrino," she said, "this is neither the time nor the place for this conversation. But if you're serious about your claim, then we'll do this properly. We'll arrange for DNA testing, we'll examine your documentation, and we'll get to the truth, one way or another." Michael nodded gratefully. "That's all I've ever wanted, just to know for certain, and maybe to finally feel like I belonged somewhere." The pain in his voice was unmistakable. Here was a man who had spent his entire life wondering about his famous father, carrying the weight of a secret that he couldn't share with anyone who would believe him. How do you tell people that Dean Martin is your father when you have no proof except a cocktail waitress's word and some faded photographs? 3 weeks later, the DNA results came back. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the geneticist who had conducted the tests, called the Martin family's lawyer with results that would rock the entertainment world if they ever became public. Michael Torrino was indeed Dean Martin's biological son, but the DNA test revealed something else, something that turned the family's understanding of their father's character completely upside down. The genetic markers showed that Michael wasn't Dean's only secret child. There were indicators of at least 2 other children, siblings that even Michael didn't know existed. The discovery sent the Martin family into crisis. How do you reconcile the image of a devoted father and family man with the reality of a man who had been secretly supporting multiple children across the country? How do you process the fact that the man you thought you knew better than anyone had been living a completely hidden life for decades? The investigation that followed revealed a pattern that had been carefully concealed for 40 years. Dean Martin had maintained separate bank accounts, used trusted intermediaries to deliver monthly payments, and created an elaborate system to ensure that his secret children were financially supported without ever having direct contact with them. The money trail led to Chicago, Las Vegas, and surprisingly, to a small town in Pennsylvania, where another woman had raised Dean's daughter in complete secrecy. Like Rosa Torrino, she had never sought publicity or tried to capitalize on her connection to one of America's biggest stars. She had simply raised her child and accepted the monthly support checks that arrived like clockwork for decades. But the most devastating discovery came when the family's private investigators uncovered the real reason why Dean had kept these children secret. It wasn't shame about extramarital affairs. Hollywood in the 1950s was remarkably tolerant of such behavior. It wasn't fear of damage to his career. Other stars had acknowledged illegitimate children without serious consequences. The truth was more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Dean Martin had been blackmailed. The evidence was buried in a safety deposit box that Dean had maintained under an assumed name for 30 years. Inside were photographs, letters, and recorded conversations that painted a picture of systematic extortion that had lasted for decades. The blackmailers weren't the mothers of his children. They were organized crime figures who had discovered Dean's secret relationships and used them as leverage to control his career decisions. Every month for 40 years, Dean had paid not only child support, but also extortion money to ensure that his secret children's existence never became public knowledge. The monthly payments that the family had discovered weren't just about financial responsibility, they were protection money to keep his children safe from men who would have used them as pawns in a much larger game. The safety deposit box contained detailed records of every payment, every threat, every time Dean had been forced to take a job or make an appearance to satisfy his blackmailer's demands. It revealed a man who had been trapped by his own success, held hostage by the very people who claimed to be his friends in the entertainment industry. Michael Torrino's mother, Rosa, had died 2 years earlier, never knowing that the man she had loved had been paying to keep their son safe, rather than simply providing financial support. She had gone to her grave believing that Dean Martin had been a responsible man who took care of his obligations, never realizing that those monthly checks had come at the cost of his freedom and peace of mind. When Michael was finally told the complete truth about his father's situation, he broke down completely. For 45 years, he had resented Dean Martin for being an absent father. He had imagined that Dean simply hadn't cared enough to be part of his life. Learning that Dean had actually been protecting him, sacrificing his own peace of mind to ensure his safety, was almost too much to bear. "He never got to know me," Michael said through his tears, "because he was too busy keeping me alive." The Martin family faced an impossible decision. They could go public with the truth about Dean's secret children and his decades of blackmail, clearing his name but exposing their half-siblings to the kind of media scrutiny that had destroyed other families. Or they could keep the secret, allowing the world to continue believing that Dean Martin had simply been an irresponsible man who abandoned his children. They chose to keep the secret, The DNA test results were sealed, the safety deposit box was emptied and closed, and the Martin family quietly reached out to their newly discovered siblings to offer them the relationship with Dean's memory that they had never been able to have with Dean himself. But the burden of knowledge changed everything for Dean's legitimate children. They understood now that their father's frequent absences, his reluctance to discuss certain periods of his career, and his sometimes distant demeanor had been the result of a man carrying an impossible weight. Every smile he had given them, every song he had sung, every moment of happiness he had provided had been paid for with a piece of his soul. Michael Torrino became a regular presence at Martin family gatherings, finally experiencing the sense of belonging he had sought his entire life. But it was bittersweet. He was finally part of Dean Martin's family, but Dean Martin was gone. The other secret children were contacted privately and invited to join the family if they chose to. Some declined, preferring to maintain the privacy they had always known. Others embraced their new relatives, creating a complex extended family bound together by secrets and grief. On the first anniversary of Dean Martin's death, the entire family, legitimate and secret children alike, gathered at his grave in Westwood Memorial Park. They didn't speak much about the discoveries of the past year. Instead, they shared stories about the man they had all loved in different ways, the father who had protected them even when they didn't know they needed protection. Deanna Martin placed a single red rose on her father's headstone and whispered, "We understand now, Daddy. We finally understand." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees, and for a moment it sounded almost like applause, the kind of gentle recognition that Dean Martin had always preferred to the thunderous ovations of his performing days. In the months that followed, the Martin family established a private foundation to help other children who had been separated from their parents by circumstances beyond their control. They never publicly connected it to Dean's story, but those who knew understood that it was his final gift to the children he had loved from a distance. The stranger who had appeared at Dean Martin's funeral had changed everything, not just for the Martin family, but for anyone who understood the real cost of fame, the price of secrets, and the lengths a father will go to protect his children, even if it means sacrificing his own happiness in the process. Dean Martin had died on Christmas Day 1995, believing he had successfully protected his secret children from a world that would have used them as weapons against him. He never knew that his death would finally set them free to claim their place in his legacy. Perhaps that was the greatest gift he could have given them, not just life and financial support, but the eventual freedom to love him openly, without fear, without shame, and without secrets. The DNA test that had confirmed Michael Torrino's paternity had revealed much more than genetic relationships. It had uncovered a story of sacrifice, protection, and love that transcended the traditional boundaries of family. In the end, Dean Martin's greatest performance hadn't been on any stage or movie screen. It had been the 40-year act of being a father to children he could never acknowledge, protector of innocence he could never hold, and guardian of secrets that had cost him everything except his soul. The funeral had ended with the traditional words, "Rest in peace, Dean Martin," but now his family understood that peace had been the one thing Dean had never been able to find in life. Perhaps, finally, in death, with all his secrets revealed and all his children united, Dino could finally rest easy.